700 years ago, Britain was rich and powerful. Then, in 1348, all that changed in an instant, when the Black Death arrived from across the waves. This terrible plague had already swept across Europe, killing millions. Now it was about to rip into an unsuspecting Britain, with a destructive force more deadly than any invading army in history. Nothing would stop the Black Death as it swept through England's cities, towns, and villages. And across the country, bodies piled up as families and communities were ravaged by the disease. Over 3 million people, around half of the population, would die in the next 2 years. No one was safe. It attacked rich and poor indiscriminately. The country was crippled, gripped by fear. I'm Dan Snow, and in this programme I'll uncover this shocking story day by day, week by week. I'll discover exactly how the Black Death got here and how it managed to take hold, causing carnage as it spread from home to home, village to town, throughout the country. This is evidence of a catastrophe that is overwhelming this community. And I'll witness the cause of the disease up close.
So a little rat just ran over my foot, and we're now surrounded by rats in here. If this was during the plague, would this be a suicidally dangerous thing to do?
While archaeologist Raksha Dave will investigate the terrifying reality of the plague.
I'd be slightly concerned if I looked in the mirror and I saw that on the side of my neck.
And the gruesome ways doctors tried to cure the dying.
So, what I'm going to need you to do is roll up a sleeve.
Okay. You're not really going to do it though, are you?
This is the terrifying story of the Black Death. England. 700 years ago, the country stood on the brink of disaster. In June 1348, as people were going about their normal daily business, they were totally unaware that their lives were about to be shattered as a deadly threat headed towards the Dorset coast. According to a contemporary account, it was just before midsummer, which was traditionally a time to take a bit of a break, have some fun before a long, hard run into harvest. But this year, there'd be no merrymaking, because out here at sea there were ships approaching. Ships from Gascony in France. And on board, we're told by the chroniclers, the sailors were sickening with a new kind of disease known as pestilence. The ships are thought to have been carrying wine, and they were heading here to Melcombe Regis in Dorset. Today, it's a quiet, picturesque part of Weymouth with a harbour full of luxury yachts and pleasure cruisers. But in 1348, this was a busy working port teeming with fishing boats and merchant ships. To the unsuspecting people of Melcombe, the approaching vessels were just 2 more boats full of goods from Europe. Nothing out of the ordinary. Looking out at the harbour now with its pleasure boats and the pubs and tourist shops along the quaysides, it's hard to imagine that 700 years ago, this was ground zero, where the most devastating disease in our history entered the country. We don't know how many sailors were infected on board those ships, and we don't know if any had already died by the time they docked. What we do know is that no attempt was made to quarantine those ships, so the infected sailors and their cargoes came ashore. At first, there was no sign that anything was wrong. They offloaded their cargo on the quayside, paid their dues at the customs house, and drank in the taverns. But while they were mingling with the locals, without anyone knowing, the disease began to take hold.
To begin with, local people around here would have reported having flu-like symptoms or feeling a bit off colour, perhaps nothing too drastic. But that was about to change. Their conditions would rapidly get worse until they would become the first victims here in Britain of the Black Death.
At that point, none of them knew that they were suffering from the most devastating disease in history, bubonic plague. Raksha has come to the old operating theatre near London Bridge to meet Dr. Susie Edge and special effects makeup artist Ruth Pease to learn more about the horrific symptoms of bubonic plague.
We've got George here, who's our Black Death volunteer, and Ruth's going to be applying all the different symptoms that he goes through. But at the moment, he's just looking a bit rough, isn't he?
For a couple of days, he's going to be feeling flu-like symptoms. So maybe a little bit nauseated, maybe a sore tummy, maybe even being sick, maybe some diarrhea. And the lymph nodes will start to grow, and that's where we see the classic buboes. Once these appear in the neck or the groin or the armpits, that's when we know that he's suffering from bubonic plague.
For those first victims in Melcombe, the appearance of large, swollen lumps, known as buboes, would have been a terrifying sight like nothing they'd seen before.
And that's where the word bubonic comes from, is from these buboes. I mean, but what are they?
The lymph nodes, where they are in the neck or throughout the body, are collections of immune cells, and that's where the bacteria are taken to try and break them up. So these are collections of pus. It's going to become really painful. Have a feel, it's going to be really tight, and you might
That is pretty gross. What day are we on? Day 4 or 5?
Day 4 or 5, yes, yeah. And after that, after day 5, we might even see them getting so big and so tight that they might burst open and the pus could come out.
At this point, a few people might survive, but many would worsen rapidly, and by day 6 or 7, their skin would turn black.
The skin is dying and it's not getting any blood. It's shutting down. I think these are the signs now that George isn't going to make it through.
So all in all, the whole process would take about a week? That's really scary, isn't it? Very rapid.
I think it is quite rapid, and the family at that point must be looking, wondering if they were going to be next.
In Melcombe, on the 23rd of June 1348, just days after the ships from Gascony had docked, the first person died of this hideous new disease. Over the next 2 weeks, more and more of the town's residents would fall ill and die. They had no idea why the disease had come here and how it was being spread. But today, we think one reason might lie in the cargo of wine the ships were carrying.
Now, wine in those days was transported in big earthenware jugs, surrounded in straw to stop them breaking on the journey. Now, that straw proved perfect, not just for stopping breakages, but for making nests in. Nests by unwanted stowaways and plague super spreaders, rats.
At the time, no one linked rats to the arrival or spread of the plague. The connection was made 500 years later in 1894 when a Swiss-French doctor, Alexandre Yersin, identified that plague was caused by a deadly bacteria found in rats. And then later research showed that the rat's fleas spread the bacteria to humans. To find out more about the role rats played in bringing the plague to Britain and then spreading it, I'm meeting Dr. David Orton at Wildwood Animal Sanctuary, home to lots and lots of rats.
So rats have got a bad reputation, haven't they? But how important were they in the spread of the plague?
It seems likely that they probably played a pretty big role in it. So the black rat, the species that we're in with here, isn't actually from Europe originally. It's a species which we think came from South Asia, and it seems to have reached the Mediterranean by the Roman period. And then when the Romans expanded through Europe, they brought it with them. So wherever you had the kind of the trade networks and the urbanism that went with the Roman Empire, we had rats as well. Certainly by the 13th century, they're ubiquitous across almost all of Europe.
So rats are a sign of a thriving economy, busy international trade, lots of people coming and going. So the famous wine trade coming up from the south of France into England, that would have been a highway for rats.
I think it's a fair bet that if you're looking at a decent-sized ship in the 13th or 14th century, it's going to have rats on it. But if you have a ship that's carrying a cargo of something like grain, the rats will multiply. You'll have a large number of rats potentially by the time it gets to wherever it's going.
And the thing about ships, they're not only a nice place for rats to live, but they move around all the time, therefore allowing plague and, well, rats and the plague to spread.
There's always the possibility some of those rats are going to go ashore.
So a little rat just ran over my foot, and we're surrounded by rats in here. 700 years ago, in a time of plague, this would have been a suicidally dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, it probably wouldn't be a great idea.
In 1347, the Black Death struck major trading ports in Europe with devastating force. In Venice, over 60,000 people died. Genoa, at least 30,000. And Marseille, 9,000. Now, in Britain, Malcolm's connection to international trade put it directly in the firing line.
It's hard to imagine just how traumatic it was for the people of Malcolm, for those who witnessed the spread of the disease, let alone those who contracted it. Just think, in the middle of June, things were fairly normal. And then within days of these ships arriving, horrifying symptoms spread through friends, neighbours, family, loved ones, many of whom would be dead within the week.
It's estimated that in total, about a third of Malcolm's population, over 400 people, died in a matter of months. The disease did begin to creep out of town, and in July, 4 deaths were reported 3 miles from Malcolm, in the village of Chickerell. But for the moment, the arrival of the Black Death was really just a local tragedy.
The big danger was that the Black Death would arrive at a major port, a big centre of population with trade and people moving in and out from other parts of the country. And sadly, that was only a matter of time.
A little over a month after the Black Death had arrived in Malcolm, 70 miles north, the first case appeared in Bristol. The Black Death was on the move. 700 years ago, Bristol was Britain's third biggest city, a densely populated port with around 10,000 inhabitants. It was a major importer of wine and exporter of wool and cloth, making it one of the wealthiest places in the country. Raksha is investigating what happened when the Black Death arrived here.
According to writers of the time, on a rainy morning somewhere between the 1st and 15th of August, a ship sailed up the Bristol Channel in preparation to dock here in the city centre. The ship was infected with the plague. Once plague arrived, it consumed the city at a terrifying rate. They said cruel death took 2 days to burst out.
The disease first took root here around Broad Street in the heart of the city. Before the Black Death, this was the Oxford Street of Bristol, where people flowed in and out of the city gates. Once bustling with merchants dealing in wool, wine and fine clothes, it quickly became deserted and overgrown with grass. Historian Dr. Evan Jones has brought me into the old city to show me how the Black Death could spread so viciously and with such speed through Bristol.
If you look at this sort of a map here, you can kind of see just how crowded a city was.
I mean, even when you look at the map itself, the city walls almost look like one giant Petri dish, don't they? Yeah. I mean, what about like the streets? Were they similar to what we're seeing here?
Oh no, they're much more crowded than this. Some of the jettied buildings, which would be crowding out on each floor, would be, if you had been looking down here in the 14th century, there had been barely any daylight between the sort of the buildings on each side. Absolutely the perfect conditions for a disease to spread.
Densely packed streets like these were home to the working classes, perhaps dockers and labourers who served the busy port. Each 5-storey house could be home to 5 families, and if plague entered one household, it wouldn't take long for it to sweep through the neighbourhood. But it wasn't just the poor who'd be struck down by disease. The crowded living conditions of the working classes made them especially vulnerable to the plague. But the wealthy weren't safe either from its deadly grip.
The rich are dying as well, and that's really well illustrated by this list of common councillors, the richest, most powerful people in the city. And you can see how the names are being crossed off the list as people die.
Do you know what, though? I find this quite shocking. Just like showing you how many people are dying so quickly in droves. Disease doesn't care for status.
No, I mean, even here, it says here, this is under the mayoralty of John Le Spicer, and then one of the first names we see crossed off the list was John Le Spicer.
Bristol's top brass fell like dominoes, and entire swathes of the city's population, from weavers to brewers, shipwrights to priests, were wiped out. In desperation, the local bishop instructed people to make their way to church and pray to God. But these gatherings would only have helped spread the disease further. The mortality rate rose so high that graveyards had to be extended to cope with the mounting bodies. With thousands of people living on top of one another, the plague was about to rip through Bristol like wildfire. In all, 7,000 people, 70% of Bristol's population, were killed by the Black Death. Nearby towns and villages now lived in fear that the plague would spread inland. Terrified that they'd be hit next, neighbouring Gloucester weren't going to take any chances.
In September 1348, the people of Gloucester heard what had happened in Bristol, only 35 miles away and easily accessible by river. They barred their gates. It was now illegal for anyone from Bristol to enter the city.
Gloucester's emergency measures bought it a little time, but the spread of the Black Death seemed unstoppable. With 80% of England's population living in the countryside, the Black Death was about to cripple the country. The settlements surrounding Bristol and Melcombe were quickly engulfed by the disease as it advanced deeper inland. In September 1348, the plague hit the small Dorset town of Gillingham. What happened here gives us one of the most detailed pictures of how the disease could devastate communities.
700 years ago, Gillingham was a small village, a collection of local subsistence peasant farmers working land owned by the manor and paying taxes to their local lord for the privilege. But what's fascinating about Gillingham is that we pretty much know who all of them were.
Gillingham's manorial court records document that there were 300 families paying rent to the lord of the manor just before the plague. Most of them were peasant farmers who'd worked the land here for generations. At the Dorset Record Office, Mark Forrest has been studying the incredible documents that tell the story of what happened to families when the Black Death struck.
So, what are each one of these documents here?
Each of these sheets of parchment records a single session of a manor court. So the manor court is held every 3 weeks at Gillingham.
And you've got all the records, all the parchments made every 3 weeks during the course of the plague.
Absolutely. What we can tell from these is because we have them before the Black Death arrives, during the Black Death and after the Black Death, we have the ability to see how many people die usually in the normal course of events. So by the 23rd of September, we've only had 4 people who've died and their relatives have come on to take their land at the manor court.
In the whole year to that date?
In the whole year to that date.
Until September 1348, Gillingham's mortality rate was low. When the Black Death arrived, all that changed.
So this is the court for the end of October. Early October, late October. And this is where the Black Death really begins to kick in. you get 20 deaths. So people are really beginning to realise that there's something quite badly wrong here.
Over the following months, the situation would become far, far worse.
So between this court, end of October, this one, beginning of November, this one, end of November, you've got people coming to the court and reporting that 100 of their relatives have died.
That's about a third,
That's about a third. In 9 weeks. And we can see them here, and we know their names. Alice LeWhite, John Shood, William Gaunt, John LeWebb, 2 cottages.
This is evidence of a catastrophe that is overwhelming this community.
It is, absolutely.
Must have been completely terrifying. Once the Black Death took hold of Gillingham, almost every household was affected. Land passed from husband to wife, from brother to brother, in a few short months, as each died just weeks after the other. They were completely helpless, and it must have felt as if their entire village was being annihilated. Mass death had struck the southwest without warning. Villages and cities alike were overwhelmed as the death rate accelerated from hundreds of people per day to thousands. Raksha has come to Nottingham University's Biomedical Research Centre to meet Professor Steve Atkinson and find out how this deadly disease was being transmitted.
So what we can see here on this image is we've got a small nematode worm which is about 1 millimetre long.
What's a nematode?
So it's a little tiny worm which swims around in the soil. We grow them in the lab and we infect them with plague bacteria. So what you're looking at is the green are the bacteria, so we've genetically modified the bacteria so that they fluoresce green, so it makes them much easier to see.
So this like really bright green that's kind of around this part of the worm, that's Black Death?
That's the plague bacteria. That's right, yeah.
So what have you actually found out then? What's happening here?
As the worm moves, the bacteria start to stick and then they start to accumulate, they grow, they replicate, but at the same time they are producing this mass, kind of a gloopy mass. It's called a biofilm, and it's a protective environment.
So it kind of protects itself inside the body of an organism.
Steve's research shows how the plague bacteria produces a protective force field which shields it from attack, making it difficult to kill. During the Black Death, it wasn't nematode worms spreading disease, but the blood-sucking parasites, fleas that lived on infected rats.
So, here we've got a flea. This is the flea gut, fills with blood containing the plague. What the plague then does is creates a biofilm inside the flea. The really cool thing about this is that what happens is that the flea's mouth parts also get blocked around here with the biofilm. The flea then tries to repeatedly feed, possibly on different people, and eventually the pressure at the back of that biofilm will be released, and then you get an injection of a really large number of plague bacteria into the new host.
Wow, so then once that flea feeds onto a human or a mammal, it kind of ejects but quite a lot of bacteria then.
A lot of bacteria, yeah. And you don't need a lot of plague bacteria to cause an infection.
700 years ago, fleas and rats were everywhere. They were part of daily life, and no one connected them to the disease, so no attempt was made to stop them. November 1348. 5 months after the Black Death first broke out in Dorset, it had now killed 500,000 people in towns and villages across the southwest of England. Over the last few months, there had been new outbreaks in Oxford, Farnham, Southampton, and Colchester. Tens of thousands of people were now dying every week. The one place that had been spared so far was London, but that was about to change. plague arrived in London on a rainy November morning. Some say from Bristol, others from Weymouth or Kent, but another likely theory is it came up the Thames on a ship bound for London's busy port. But what's truly remarkable is that London, the most connected, densely populated city in the kingdom, has survived thus far unscathed.
"700 years ago, London was a very different place from today. It was a walled city only 2 miles across, bordered by the Fleet River in the west and the Tower of London in the east. More than 70,000 people lived cramped together within those walls, and the plague quickly spread through its streets.
Until November, London had been thriving, but now it was rapidly turning into a ghost town. A witness from the time tells us that the mood was one of dismal solitude. Shops were shut, people rare, no one walking about on the streets, and the only sound was that of the moaning of the dying. London was effectively in lockdown.
Sheltered in his palace at Westminster, even the king himself couldn't escape the terror.
Edward III was one of England's most powerful kings, a strong monarch, builder of castles, conqueror of French territory. If anyone was going to come through unscathed, you thought it would be him, locked away in his grand palace, isolated here at Westminster. But Edward was in a miserable state. The plague had reached the threshold of the royal family itself. Just a couple of months before, his daughter, Princess Joan, had gone down with the disease.
She was on her way to marry a Spanish prince when she was struck down travelling through France. The king would never see her again.
Edward III wrote to the King of Castile. He said, "No fellow human being could be surprised if we were inwardly feeling desolated by the sting of grief." It's an amazing thing to have such a candid description of emotions from one of Europe's most powerful men, particularly over 700 years later. It just shows that the Black Death was a true leveller.
Whether you were rich or poor, young or old, it was clear that nowhere and no one was safe. I've come to the Weald and Downland Museum in West Sussex to meet historian Eleanor Yanega to find out why the plague was able to spread so easily through 14th century homes.
That's a nice little dwelling.
I know, isn't it great?
So who would have lived here?
During the Black Death, lower class of peasant.
Okay.
I say lower class because, you know, peasant just means you're a farmer.
Someone working the land.
Exactly.
Okay. Is the fact they lived like this responsible for the terrible mortality of the Black Death?
To a certain degree, yeah, but not in the way that most people think. Okay, because a big thing that people tend to bring up when they think about the medieval period is, well, effluent.
It's stinky and they're just throwing all their rubbish in the street and they're poo in their wee.
Exactly. And that's not actually true.
Okay.
First of all, if you're out here in the countryside, you probably have a designated spot that you kind of use like an outhouse, something of that description. Most cities, you know, like London, York, they have regulations that say you absolutely cannot just like go throwing your chamber pots in the street. So there's something that's called a midden. So you would have that kind of behind your house, or, you know, in cities there's sometimes kind of like corporate ones that are owned by the city itself. And you take your trash, you put it in there, you bury it. But this is one of the health problems, because having a bunch of garbage buried in one area attracts rats. So if you've got a lovely little midden out back that the rats can go get lunch at, they might come and, you know,
move into your house.
Mm-hmm.
It's nice and cozy, yeah. Wow, yeah, you can see a rat would be at home in here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And let's have a look at the thatching in here. They can like get in there, make a nice little nest.
Ooh.
You know, you've got the hearth right in the middle of the room. So if you have a nest up in the roof, you're gonna have all this kind of like nice warm air rushing up. Great place to live if your source of food is just outside.
And you can imagine the little pitter-patter of feet up here in the rafters. And there would have been food inside, I guess, as well.
So back in here is a kitchen. So a rat can just run in there and nab some of your food anytime they like. You know, in this situation, even the furniture lends itself to rats getting in. More particularly, there's rats in the bed.
Little bed.
Yeah, yeah.
Shall I
So
go on the medieval bed?
yeah, try it out, try it out.
Ah, it's quite cosy.
Right? Straw mattress, this is what we're working with here. More comfortable than you would think. Problem is, if it's comfortable for you, it's also comfortable for rats and fleas.
So there's plague in the beds?
In the beds. And this is kind of really heartbreaking, actually, because say you are a peasant who's living at this level of poverty. One of the few things you're going to have to look forward to every day is getting into your nice, comfy bed and relaxing at night. And it's just those little creature comforts that are available to ordinary people that make you susceptible to the plague.
The kind of place you think you're going to be safest is actually a place where you could contract plague.
Yeah, exactly.
People's living conditions did help the spread of the plague, but today we don't think that was the only reason that homes were hotbeds for disease. 700 years after the Black Death, research at Nottingham University is now revealing another cause. The plague wasn't just being spread by rats and fleas, it was also being spread by human body lice too. Professor Atkinson explains exactly how they transmit it.
So what they do is they actually scratch the surface of the skin. They don't actually penetrate into the skin. While they're feeding, they are probably pooing as well. But then what happens is, because there's irritation from the feeding, there is a potential for someone to scratch and then rub the poo into the open wound.
Oh, it's pretty gross, but very effective as a bacteria, isn't it?
Yeah. And not only that, but the poo, there's large quantities of it. If it dries out, it can be aerosolized and it could potentially then spread and people could then breathe it in.
Because when you explain it in that way, you realise that it's very easy to catch it.
Absolutely, and people were living in close proximity to each other. They were sharing clothes, they were sharing bedclothes, maybe all living in one room.
Not washing their clothes.
Exactly, and so, yeah, it offers an additional explanation to how the organism could be transmitted.
Yersinia pestis, the superbacteria.
The superbacteria, indeed.
Rats, fleas, and lice were now spreading the disease at a devastating rate. Up and down the country, doctors desperately try to find ways to cure the sick and dying. I'm investigating some of the methods they used with medical historian Kevin Goodman.
So these are the kind of typical things that a surgeon will be using in their daily practice.
Yeah.
I mean, how are they going to help me if I've got the Black Death?
Okay, we've got a few hooks and probes over there for pulling back flesh and muscles. And we've got a selection of cauterizing irons.
I quite like the look of this.
So, this is a flame that is used for cutting into flesh and releasing blood from the vein.
I mean, why would you want to do that, though?
You've got an excess of blood, in particular, bad blood.
Oh, so the medieval surgeon will be trying to get rid of the blood.
Exactly, bad blood, yes.
Yeah.
So, what I'm going to need you to do is roll up a sleeve.
Okay. You're not really going to do it, though, are you?
So what we'd do, we'd get the knife or the flame and we'd make a cut, and then, as you're clenching the fist, some blood would drip out, and then when we've considered to take enough blood, if I could have your finger, there you are, until it stops bleeding.
So what examples can you show me of the things that you would do if I came to you if I had a massive bubo on my neck?
What we have to do with a bubo is we've really got to burst it to help the body. One way would be to use a cauterizing iron and then pop the bubo.
Ooh. I bet that's going to be quite stinky though, isn't it?
Yes, and painful. But that's not the only way I've got of bursting a bubo.
What's the other way?
I could actually use one of these, a cupping glass. So what we would do is, we We get our flame again. We would make a cut, and then we would heat the cup up, place it over the bubo, and as it cools down, a vacuum is created, and it would cause all the bad blood to be drawn out of the bubo.
What about the more refined medicine and practices?
Well, I could make you a nice ointment. So what we have here is some nice hog's lard and the magic ingredient, some vitriol.
What's vitriol?
Sulfuric acid.
Hang on. You want to put that on my skin? I don't think so.
No.
I'm not surprised it burst.
Well, it is being played very convincingly by some wine vinegar for this occasion.
And then you just simply mix it all together.
Yeah, that's quite a bit mixed up there.
Oh, meaty. I can smell that now.
For the acid, so we'll just put a drop in there. So it's going to be the sulfuric acid that eats into the bubo, but the fat is the carrier. That's holding it there. Right.
Right, then go on then, slap it on. Lovely. I mean, it feels nice, but I'm not really getting how this is going to help.
Basically, what's happening is the acid is going into the bubo. It's
Right.
softening it up.
Yeah.
So that will allow us to burst it, basically.
It's an interesting approach. Or would it really have worked?
Not really. The terror would be undescribable. So, yeah, whatever, they would try it.
With no understanding about germs, these brutal tools could actually infect wounds, killing, not curing their patients. The plague had now spread from the West Country to London and the South East, taking out almost half the population of most places. Ordinary life was grinding to a halt. Nearly every village, town and city fell eerily quiet, except one. I've come to Canterbury in Kent. By November 1348, this city, like many big centres in the south, had been hit hard by the plague. Thousands had already died. Unlike other towns and cities across the country that were emptying as people fled from built-up areas, Canterbury was filling up. People were flocking here. And that's because they thought, in a time of terrifying disease, the one person who might be able to help was God. I've come to the cathedral to meet Dr. Cressida Lang to find out why so many flocked here during the Black Death. On these steps, you can see how worn they are. These are hundreds of years of people doing exactly that.
Absolutely, thousands of feet coming up these stairs.
And what are they here to see, particularly?
So they're here to see the golden shrine of St. Thomas Becket.
200 years before the Black Death, Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was murdered in this cathedral. The golden shrine holding his body brought pilgrims here in droves, in the hope that he could cure them and their loved ones.
They were keen, obviously, to pray, to visit the tomb, but also to bring something home, to bring a souvenir home. So what we have here is an example of a pilgrim badge. So this is a medieval ampulla, a little receptacle that was sold containing water just tinged with the blood of Becket.
No. So if your family are sick, your neighbours, that might help.
Yes, there was a strong belief that this, having been brought back from Canterbury, a pilgrim souvenir filled with the water, touched with Becket's blood, would have had healing properties.
I completely understand why they'd believe that, but what was in reality, everyone coming here must have been quite a health risk.
Yes, I mean, something like this brought psychological comfort, sort of calmed the soul, but so many people gathering in Canterbury, maybe in crowded conditions, must have caused some spread of the plague.
It's desperately sad to think of people going to all of this effort to try and avoid the plague, to try and save themselves, actually might have put themselves in harm's way.
Inevitably, but the draw to come here to seek healing and comfort was just so strong.
But nothing could halt the relentless spread of the disease. Every day, the Black Death moved even faster, and the numbers continued to grow. Nowhere felt the force of the devastation more than England's capital. This is Charterhouse Square. Today it's a quiet park close to St Paul's Cathedral in central London. In 2013, engineers constructing a shaft for a new underground railway unearthed something extraordinary. 700 years ago, when London's residents began to fall ill with the plague, this land had been used as a mass burial ground. Raksha is meeting archaeologist Don Walker to find out more.
So you uncovered a really gruesome discovery, didn't you?
Well, the lucky thing for us was with Crossrail, we got to excavate in areas where we normally wouldn't be able to. And we went down 3 metres below this surface, and we got down to the original Black Death cemetery. We were lucky enough to find some of the burials from this emergency burial ground.
As Don's team dug in the narrow shaft, they uncovered the remains of 25 people. Just the tip of the iceberg, as archaeologists estimate as many as 20,000 could be buried here. But intriguingly, although hundreds of the dead were being brought here every week, the bodies weren't just being thrown carelessly into the pit.
The burials were well ordered, carefully placed in the ground. Some of them obviously had coffins. They weren't all in some mass pit. They were in individual graves.
And that's really surprising, isn't it? Because I think that sometimes that people would just kind of go, all right, well, I'll just sling them in. But what you're saying is the complete exact opposite of that.
That's the amazing thing about these burials. This was the greatest disaster to hit the world. And the rate of mortality was higher than anything else they'd ever experienced. And yet, they still seem to manage to bury these people in the normal way.
One of the skeletons unearthed in the plague pit is today preserved in the Charterhouse Museum, and Don and his team have been able to discover more about them.
So Don, this is one of the 25 skeletons that was found in the plague pit.
That's right. This is a male individual. They died between the ages of 18 and 25 years of age, so a young adult in the prime of life. And we know from isotope studies that they were brought up outside London, somewhere in eastern or southern England, and they moved to London when they were about 5 years of age.
It's quite sobering, isn't it, to think that they knew this disease was coming, that people were going to get struck down by it, that they had to make these makeshift burial grounds and prepare themselves. There were bodies just streaming in on a daily basis being buried here, but with such care and respect.
Yeah, I think it shows that there's a certain amount of administrative control, and it may even have come from quite a high level, perhaps even the monarch. And I think it does show respect for the population, but also shows that they were prepared to deal with an emergency that they knew was approaching.
1 in 10 Londoners resident here in 1348 are thought to be buried beneath this park. In all, the Black Death left at least 35,000 people in London dead, 50% of the population. Almost every Londoner must have lost a family member, neighbour or friend.
In the 6 months since plague had arrived in the summer of 1348, it had torn through southern England. But now there were hopes as Christmas approached that the cold weather might kill it off. Those hopes were about to be shattered. In the next programme, I'll uncover the progress of the Black Death from New Year 1349. I'll investigate how it became a pandemic, causing devastation and terror from London all the way to York in the north. Now, in the space of a couple of weeks, these kids have gone from having a life of quite relative luxury
Yeah.
to mum and dad dead, possibly moving cities to Hull. I'll discover how some people may have been more likely to catch the disease.
People who succumb to the Black Death seem to carry a particular variant of a gene.
And Raksha will witness the brutal punishments carried out as the country descended into chaos.
What you got right here is a whipping frame.
Does it get much worse than this then?
I'm afraid it does.
"700 years ago, Britain was rich and powerful. Then, in 1348, all that changed in an instant, when the Black Death arrived from across the waves.
This terrible plague had already swept across Europe, killing millions. Now it was about to rip into an unsuspecting Britain, with a destructive force more deadly than any invading army in history.
Nothing would stop the Black Death as it swept through England's cities, towns, and villages. And across the country, bodies piled up as families and communities were ravaged by the disease.
Over 3 million people, around half of the population, would die in the next 2 years. No one was safe. It attacked rich and poor indiscriminately. The country was crippled, gripped by fear.
I'm Dan Snow, and over 2 programmes I'm exploring the terrifying story of how the Black Death arrived and then spread through the country, day by day, month by month. Last time, I learned how the plague was first discovered in England in June 1348 in a small Dorset town, and how it began to spread rapidly across the country.
This is evidence of a catastrophe that is overwhelming this community.
Now, in this second episode, I'll uncover the progress of the Black Death from New Year 1349. I'll investigate how it became a pandemic, causing devastation and terror from London all the way to York in the north.
So in the space of a couple of weeks, these kids have gone from having a life of quite relative luxury to mum and dad dead.
I'll discover how some people may have been more likely to catch the disease.
People who succumb to the Black Death seem to carry a particular variant of a gene.
And archaeologist Raksha Dave explores the brutal punishments meted out as the country descended into chaos.
What you got right here is a whipping frame.
Does it get any much worse than this then?
I'm afraid it does.
This is the terrifying story of the Black Death.
England, New Year 1349. For 6 months, the Black Death had travelled rapidly through southern England. Thousands of people were infected with a deadly bacteria, spread by rat, fleas and body lice, which caused bubonic plague. They suffered agonising lumps in their necks. Just days later, 60% of them were dead. Over 600,000 people died as cities, towns and villages were engulfed one by one. In November, England's capital, London, was hit. Just 2 months later, it was on its knees. Once busy streets were now empty, and mass graves were piled high with the bodies of Londoners.
Day and night, the streets of London were filled with the shrieks of those suffering and the moans of mourners. A witness says that people barked like dogs from the pain, and when there was silence,
it was probably because death had come. The situation was dreadful. In just 2 months, 3,500 people died across the capital. No one was safe. The disease ripped through homes indiscriminately, killing young and old, rich and poor. Even King Edward III was affected when his daughter Joan died of the plague. Britain stood on the edge of catastrophe. Something needed to be done. In January, London went into meltdown. The King was here at Westminster and he ordered Parliament to stop meeting until Easter. A few weeks later, on the 26th, the King shut down one of the most senior courts in the land, the King's Bench, where lots of the royal business got done. So it seemed as though even the monarchy was packing up shop. By the beginning of January, the disease was rampaging through London at an extraordinary rate, from the centre to the suburbs. Before the Black Death, the manor of Stepney on the eastern outskirts of the city had a population of about 1,000. By the end of February, 10% of them were already dead, and the rate was rising rapidly. In Aldersgate Street, just a stone's throw from St Paul's Cathedral, there's even more horrific evidence of the terrifying speed at which Londoners were dying. Today, Aldersgate is a busy thoroughfare running through the commercial heart of London. But back at the time of the plague, this was one of the main routes north out of the walled city through Aldersgate, which was just down there. This area has always been bustling with people, travelling in and out of the city. But as the Black Death overwhelmed London, Aldersgate became packed with a rather more grim flow of traffic. So many Londoners were now dying that they were running out of space within the city walls to bury the dead. So they dug big new plague pits out here, just to the north of the city. The dead were then transported along this road for burial in those pits. From early February to the middle of April 1349, 200 bodies a day were transported along this road. If you've been standing here at that time, you'd have seen the equivalent of one body pass every 5 minutes. As thousands perished in the first half of 1349, London wasn't the only place suffering. Death rates soared across southern England, although the picture was better further north. So far, in the 8 months since plague had arrived in Dorset in June 1348, it hadn't ripped the entire country apart. The disease had been contained down here in the south, and people in the north, well, they'd been largely unaffected. But in the summer of 1349, all that was about to change. This is the city of York, second only to London in importance at the time. By the 14th century, it had grown rich and famous from its thriving textile industry. It was a booming trade centre for grain and imported luxury goods, everything from wine to spices. For nearly a year after the disease first arrived in England, the city still hadn't been hit by the plague. But the wealthy people living in the shadow of York Minster had been anxiously watching it spread. On the 28th of July 1348, around a month after the Black Death first arrived on English shores, the Archbishop of York wrote about his sense of impending gloom. He said, "The pitiless death that spares no one now threatens us." Dark times for his flock here in York. Everyone in the city feared it was just a matter of time before the Black Death would hit. And in the early summer of 1349, their fears were realised. On the 21st of May, the Black Death crept unseen into York. No one knows for sure how it got here. Perhaps it was rats in the bilges of the ships that carried the city's grain up the river here. We do know that this river, the Ouse, flooded, and that may have driven rats with their infected fleas up, away from the riverbank, into the city and among the population. Even though York's citizens expected to be hit, they were totally unprepared for the scale of the catastrophe that would follow. A chronicler wrote that people were terrified. They had no idea what to do. There were houses in which every single member of the household died. And news of that just meant that in future, when one person went down sick, the rest of the inhabitants would flee, thus spreading the disease even faster. In York's densely populated centre, the disease spread rapidly, consuming the city house by house, street by street. I've come into the heart of York, where 14th century roads and buildings still survive. Now they've become a rather quaint tourist destination, and no one who visits today is aware that these were once avenues of death. This narrow, historic street in York gives you a real sense of what an ideal environment it would have been for disease transmission. It's called the Shambles, which is derived from the Old English for meat market. It's basically a slaughterhouse. So you've got tightly packed human beings all pushed together, the buildings almost touching at the gables, but you've also got animals being brought in here in never-ending supply from the countryside roundabouts and being slaughtered. These gutters running red with blood. The ideal breeding ground for fleas and lice that would spread the disease throughout the population of York. As a result of these appalling conditions, by the end of May 1349, a matter of days after the Black Death first arrived in York, there were roughly 400 deaths recorded within the city. And that number was growing rapidly. The disease moved so fast that experts no longer think it could just have been spread by rats, fleas and lice. New research suggests that something else was happening, that the deadly plague bacteria were now taking to the air. Bristol University is exploring how the airborne plague bacteria made transmission even faster and more furious. Raksha is meeting Professor Jonathan Reed to find out more.
So this is our aerosol science lab. This is where we look at the aerosol that can contain bacteria and can transmit a disease.
So I'm a bit confused because I thought the Black Death was spread by things that bite, like rats and lice and fleas.
What you're talking about is bubonic plague, but we know that actually the bacteria can be transmitted in the air, and that leads to pneumonic plague, and that infects the lungs.
Bubonic plague causes terrible swellings after entering the bloodstream, whereas the pneumonic variety causes a severe hacking cough, where blood is eventually vomited by the victim. A simple test can show how a cough can spread disease rapidly.
So what we have here is some water-sensitive paper, and when a water droplet makes contact with it, for example, when you're coughing, those aerosol droplets you're generating, they turn the paper blue.
Here goes.
So look at that, you can begin to see the droplets appearing there.
You can.
And those droplets are the ones that could carry bacteria from person to person. And it's actually more than that, because not only does coughing lead to transmission, but there are other respiratory activities which can lead to transmission.
By simply breathing or coughing, people were now spreading the disease, and that meant the number of people infected rose. At the time of the Black Death, neighbours were living in such close proximity that avoiding transmission would have been next to impossible. Jonathan's second experiment will show how much bacteria can be emitted when someone is speaking or coughing.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Lauren to show me now the particles that you're breathing out. Okay, so this is going to be shown by the black line at the top.
The particles are the aerosol droplets that we generate when we breathe, speak or cough.
We hear the particles, we also see the black line rise, generating aerosol containing bacteria in your lungs and breathing them out into the room. And now what I want you to do is I want you to vocalize, and we'll see how many particles you generate. Off the scale, maybe 50 to 100 times more when you vocalize than when you're just breathing.
So if I was coughing and I had the Black Death and it spread in a room, what would the outcome be for the other people that were there?
So if you have bubonic plague, then there's about a 50% chance that you survive. If it's pneumonic plague and it's transmitted through aerosol droplets that you breathe into your lungs, you're likely not to survive.
Gosh, so faster transmission and more deadly. It's pretty shocking.
Exactly.
700 years ago, at the time of the York outbreak, no one had any idea how the Black Death was transmitted. But it would now bring an invisible Armageddon.
Once the Black Death became airborne, it was far more deadly. It became even more difficult to avoid those infected. Every man, woman and child in Britain was now dicing with death.
Over the coming months, this deadly disease began to engulf the entire country, and no one knew when or if it would be stopped. By the end of July 1349, up to 1 million people had died of the Black Death, and the body count continued to rise. The disease had been ravaging most of southern England for nearly a year. Now it had spread north, and the great city of York was feeling its deadly force. Death was spreading on the air. It seemed like a medieval apocalypse.
The people of York are very familiar with death by now, living in a state of terror. All of them scared that they will be the next victim of this plague.
I've come to the Borthwick Institute in York, where an incredible 700-year-old record of the terror that gripped the city is being investigated by York University archivist Gary Brannan.
So this covers the period of the Black Death, and specifically in the register we are looking at the wills that were made and proved at that time.
And what can any of these wills tell us about the Black Death in York?
Rather unsurprisingly, a lot of people died. So there are relatively few wills proved in 1347 and 1348, and then you see in 1349 the number of wills being proved just shoots up, which is just a reflector of increased mortality.
Wow. And is this one of the wills here?
So this, what you can see here, is the will of a gentleman called John Tuck.
John Tuck was a wealthy wine merchant by trade, with land and a small fortune, which he wanted to leave to his family in the event of his death.
We can think of him as an affluent businessman, really, and a sort of mainstay of York society at the time.
Yeah, definitely. This is a reasonably important guy in the community.
So he makes a will as the Black Death arrives in York. He's obviously feeling a bit worried about it. Does he survive? Do we know?
We do know what happened. It's on the other side, as these things often are on the back. That is the note that says the will was proved in the church courts a week later. So he didn't.
These ancient documents reveal a terrible human story. John must have contracted the Black Death just days after he'd written his will, if not just before. It's quite possible he caught pneumonic plague after breathing in the deadly bacteria. He'd have developed a terrible fever and hacking cough, spitting up blood for just a few days before succumbing, like so many others in York. But I'd like to know if the documents tell us anything about the fate of John Tuck's relatives.
Do we know anything about his family? Do we know anything more?
We know he had a family, we know he had a wife, he had kids. There's an entry in the register a little bit further on which reveals something about what happened after he died. None of his executors, which includes his wife, came to prove the will. In fact, it was one of the witnesses, a guy called John de Wintringham, goes to prove the will. What that suggests is that his wife has also died. and that John Wintringham is applying or has taken on the tuition and the curation of these children. And in fact, John Tuck's older son, we think is in Hull, says, actually, no, I want to look after my 2 younger sisters.
So in the space of a couple of weeks, these kids have gone from having a life of quite relative luxury, affluence, to mum and dad dead, possibly moving cities to Hull.
Yes, yeah.
John Tuck and his wife were just 2 of the thousands of people who died from the plague in York. Over the next month, the city was turned into a mortuary. Thousands contracted the disease. This is from an account at the time. How many valiant men, how many fair ladies breakfast with their kinfolk and the same night supped with their ancestors in the next world. The condition of the people was pitiable to behold. They sickened by the thousands daily and died unattended and without help. Many died in the open street. Others, dying in their houses, made it known by the stench of their rotting bodies. The smell of death was now everywhere. I'm meeting medieval historian Eleanor Janiger to find out how people desperately tried to protect themselves.
So there's this idea of miasma, which is that bad smells or bad odors are the thing that's causing disease. And for example, that could be floating around somebody who's ill and they kind of maybe start to smell bad, something like that. But if you can block that out with something that smells sweet, like a herb, then you're in, you'll be fine.
So for them, smell was the thing they really associated with plague.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about it, it's actually really sophisticated because, you know, they know that people get sick, they know it's invisible, and so they're like, well, maybe it's the air, it smells bad, right? But one of the things that you can do is you can make yourself a nosegay using all these beautiful herbs.
A nosegay? What is a nosegay?
It could be like a bouquet. It's the middle of summer, get yourself some lilies, get yourself some roses, carry a bouquet in front of your nose, that'll work. Otherwise, we're making kind of like a crushed up poultice. We're gonna put it in some muslin and then we'll carry that in front of our noses.
I'm ready. What do we need in here?
Okay, so let's go with some cloves because it smells like Christmas. We love it.
I love that.
A little bit of juniper because juniper just too classic. Sage.
Okay, this is the tough stuff.
So we'll put that together.
Okay.
And then you would take your muslin, put that inside.
Let me just give that a little smell. See the nose. Oh, it smells like health.
Mmm.
Okay.
And so now we've got one that we've made up earlier.
Okay, so this is all that stuff.
Inside a muslin.
And you would just walk along like this?
Yep, absolutely. Just block it out. So, you know, if you don't have to smell the bad air, then you're going to be protected from the plague. That's the idea.
Jeez. That's amazing, isn't it? In some way, this just, it feels like, well, it just feels so insufficient. What we now know about the deadliness of that disease, how it spreads, and this is all they had.
Yeah, it's, when you think about it, it's actually really heartbreaking because people are so desperate for something that they can do. And this is something that's available to ordinary people. They can put this together. But obviously, it's not really going to do anything. And it's such a small kind of piecemeal thing in the middle of basically unimaginable horror.
Up and down the country, people tried everything to halt the disease, but it was no use. In cities like York, the disease was unstoppable. The final death toll was enormous. The great city of York had been devastated. Things almost ground to a halt. There were hardly enough bakers to make the bread or people to work the fields. And it wasn't just York. The entire country was now plunged into an economic and humanitarian catastrophe. England, 1349. Just 1 year before, everyone from lords to villagers had been happily going about their daily business. Now, many of them were dead. As bodies piled up, drastic measures were taken to deal with death. Up and down the country, mass graves were dug. One of the largest plague pits outside London was discovered in the grounds of Hereford Cathedral in 1993. Up to 400 bodies were buried there. Now, at Bradford University, analysis of their skeletons is revealing horrifying details of the impact of the disease. To find out exactly what was happening, Raksha's meeting bone expert Joe Buckberry.
What kind of skeletons were there in this pit?
Normally in a medieval population you will have lots of children and babies, but these Black Death cemeteries, the age pattern seems to mimic that of the age structure of a living population, so that you're actually seeing older children, teenagers, younger adults in higher proportions than you would do in a normal cemetery, and that's a really good way of figuring out if you are looking at that kind of catastrophic event that just takes out so many people.
I mean, that's quite stark, isn't it, when you think about it, that it's not really preying on what we perceive to be the vulnerable. So is that what we're seeing here in these 3 individuals that you've laid out? I mean, this is obviously a child.
This is a child, died between about 6 and 8 years old, and we can tell that because we've got teeth. You can see that it's developing still, so this is a canine, and it hasn't finished forming, it doesn't have its root.
So how do we know that this child died of the plague?
So first of all, we've got the fact that they're buried in a mass grave. We then have radiocarbon dates, and these are securely dated to the 14th century. And so they span the first 3 waves of the plague that start in 1348. So we know that they are the right time period. And then we did some collaborative work looking at the ancient DNA, and only a small number of individuals were sampled, and those came back for Yersinia pestis, which is the pathogen thought to cause the Black Death. The balance of probabilities is that all of these individuals died of the plague. So that's an adult female. She probably died between about 20 and 25 years old. And that's really important for this sort of overall picture, because she's a woman of prime childbearing age. So not only have we lost her and her contribution to society, we've lost her potential to have more children.
You can see how devastating the Black Death was, because you're just striking out those core people that you need for your society to function, your town to function. It must have been terrifying.
You know, if everybody around you is ill and people are dying very, very rapidly and very, very frequently, the fear that you will be next is going to be present for everybody. And of course, they don't have the knowledge that we do now as to what was causing this, or the ability to change their actions to try and prevent the deaths from happening. No idea of how to stop transmission, and I think that's an enormously scary thing.
These bodies from Hereford's plague pits are grim evidence of why the Black Death was so catastrophic. It wasn't just targeting the sick and elderly, it was killing ordinary, healthy members of the population, indiscriminately. Throughout July and August 1349, a year after it arrived in the UK, the disease continued to consume villages, towns and cities from Devon to Yorkshire. But it wasn't done yet. Back in London, King Edward III had taken action.
Edward was desperate to try and stop the spread of death and disease throughout his kingdom. He tried everything. He got the Archbishop of Canterbury to write special prayers that could be distributed to every parish. But the Archbishop died before he could finish the job. When the prayers were sent out, they didn't make much difference. He got the Mayor of London to clean up the streets of his city, hoping that by removing the filth and the stench it might curb the disease. But that didn't work either. So Edward changed tack. If he couldn't stop people dying, he could at least try and stop his country falling apart.
To find out how King Edward tried to get a grip, I'm heading to Borough Market to meet someone who studied the terrible situation facing the king. Historian Barney Sloane. I guess markets like this, that would have been where you could take the pulse of the nation.
Yeah, so Borough Market has been here for 1,000 years. It's at the southern edge of London Bridge itself. All of that trade coming into London, and suddenly there would have been a huge jolt to that trade.
So in this market, there have been fewer customers and fewer farmers and traders bringing in their goods?
Fewer customers, fewer farmers and traders, and people trying to push the prices up, and Edward trying to push them down again. Edward has to act. He has to stop runaway inflation. If you imagine that there are now half the number of labourers in the land, still with the same amount of land to labour on, still with the same amount of materials to collect, then he has to say, OK, look, we've got to control prices and wages. So he creates this set of rules that says you shall not be paid any more than you were in 1346. And anybody who's 60 years old or younger has to work. And it applies to absolutely everything. He brings in rules to make sure that the lords and mayors have to follow the rules. And not only that, but the people who police it have to follow the rules as well. So it is an absolute pressure cooker on the economy.
We're in a time of inflation again now, and if there's posh cheese over here or these smelly cans, if you went round and said, actually, I'm only going to pay you what they were worth last year, the traders would laugh at you.
They would, yeah, absolutely. And this is why it was a doomed attempt to try to manage the economy from the top.
So there's been this calamity, but Edward III doesn't seem to be in compromising mood.
He can't. The economic shock to markets like this up and down the country, to the labour supply right around the country, he has to act. No compromise, everybody gets put under these controls.
By the summer of 1349, the Black Death had attacked nearly the whole of England. One by one, cities had been ravaged. Towns and villages laid waste. Nearly 50% of people in the major cities had died. In York, 10,000. In Manchester, 4,000 deaths. In Bristol, 7,000. And in London itself, the body count reached a horrifying 35,000. The country was on its knees. And yet the king, Edward III, imposed new rules, saying that people should stop moaning, pay their taxes and get to work, otherwise the country would fall apart. But obviously, these were pointless. The damage was done. It was like putting a small bandage on a gaping wound. People were scared, they were angry, and they didn't care about the rules anymore. Across the country, peasants were now beginning to revolt and stand up to their lords and masters. I've come to the city of Durham to see how law and order was breaking down. By July 1349, the situation here was dire. Half the population had been killed by the Black Death, but people were still under orders to keep calm and carry on. At Durham University, there is some evidence from the time revealing the anger of local people. It's being investigated by Dr. Rachel Harks.
We have court records that survive right here in front of us, which record rents that were being paid for land. And even in the height, in July 1349, the courts were meeting to collect rents.
That's brutal. So at the height of the pandemic, people are still coming knocking on the door saying, come on, where's the rent money?
Exactly. These are being written by the steward of the Bishop of Durham.
The bishop, we think of them leading prayer in the cathedral, but actually they're massive landowners.
Absolutely. They're Lord Bishops. They own thousands of acres of land, and they're responsible for making sure that it's farmed. And the steward is the one that's enacting the bishop's will.
The steward at the time was Sir Thomas Grey, the bishop's right-hand man and his key advisor. It was Sir Thomas's job to visit the villages and towns of the county to collect the bishop's taxes on his behalf. But resistance was in the air.
So, in July, he's going around to collect rent. And in it, he's listing who is paying for what and how much. So if we look here, early on in July, in a village called Houghton, it says, none wishes to make their rents for fear of the pestilence.
Right, because if you've got any spare money during a pandemic, you think, let's maybe save it. You don't know what the future's going to hold. What else have we got here?
When tenants died, then that land was transferred to new tenants within the village, sometimes against their will, and they didn't feel they had the capacity to farm it and to make their rents.
So you're a kind of subsistence farmer, You then get told, by the way, you have to farm that neighbouring plot as well. You're getting no more help to do it, and we're going to charge you rent.
Yes, exactly.
Wow. Brutal.
So in this folio, we find what happened when tenants resisted the bishop's authority in farming land. The coroner, one of the bishop's officials, overhears 9 tenants talking about how they're going to run away and find better land elsewhere. He records how they didn't pay their rent in March, and so the coroner arrests them and throws them into jail.
So you get a real sense here of how the traditional way of doing things, of living, is breaking down. These labourers like, hey, I'm off to next door's estate, they're going to pay me more money, and that's causing real tension.
It is. There's a back and forth that we see between the bishop's men and the tenants.
So amidst the tragedy of the Black Death, life was changing for people in County Durham. Not only the terrible mortality of the Black Death, but also things were becoming a bit looser and law and order was beginning to break down a little bit. Now, it doesn't sound too unreasonable to us that a peasant might not really want to pay a load of extra rent to a lord during an appalling time of disease for land that he's being forced to farm. But times were different back then. For a peasant to stand up to his lord like this was almost an act of rebellion. It was an offence, and there were consequences. The fact that normal people were now willing to break the rules shows just how desperate the situation had become. 700 years ago, punishments were harsh. You could be imprisoned or put in the stocks, but it could be far worse. Raksha's investigating the gruesome punishments with historian Eleanor Yanega.
What about this? It looks like an instrument of torture. I mean, obviously, you must put your hands in here.
Mm-hmm. And then what you also have is this, a whip.
Ooh.
Because what you got right here is a whipping frame. This is sort of like the bridging world between the stocks, where you have public humiliation, but with pain added in. So you need to have stolen something a little bit more serious here. You've stolen somebody's sheep, something like that.
You do this in front of your community?
Absolutely. It's not just the humiliation here, there's something else again on top of it. And that's kind of how medieval punishment works. It's cumulative. The worse the crime is, the more pain is going to be involved.
So would rich people also get whipped as well?
No. just straight up. You know, this is a very kind of like a class-based thing, right? This is the sort of thing that will happen to poor people who bother rich people.
Does it get any much worse than this then?
I'm afraid it does.
So what's the next level?
Branding.
Oh, that's the sizzle and the smell of meat is quite hideous when you put it into a human context.
It's supposed to be horrible. It's supposed to be horrifying. They're attempting to inflict pain, but that's not all. You'll be branded in a really prominent part of your body.
Like where, for example?
Your forehead.
No.
Your arm. Your hand, somewhere that people are going to see really often. You need to have the grossest, most viscerally horrible punishment that there is, and everyone needs to be telling stories about it.
So what about crime and punishment during the Black Death?
So there's kind of two things that are happening here. There's not a lot of people to catch you doing crimes during the Black Death, but if they do, they're going to go all the way to the top really quickly and do the worst possible punishment to remind people that, in theory, there's supposed to be some semblance of law and order.
Even though there were harsh punishments, people still broke the law. I suppose they wanted to have a few good days in the short time they had left in this world. It's just impossible to imagine how brutal this period was. Not only did they face the physical perils of the Black Death itself, but they faced extreme hunger and pressure from society to pay their way, despite their families, loved ones dying all around them. It was a dire situation. It was about to get worse. By the winter of 1349, the Black Death had laid waste to the whole country. Half of England had died, and the rest were impoverished, exhausted, and overwhelmed. Every town, city, and village in the country was impacted by the terrible death toll.
Some places like Crawley saw such appalling losses that the population didn't recover to pre-pandemic levels until the 1850s. That's 500 years later.
Across Britain, villages started to literally disappear, their population dying or leaving. To investigate the level of devastation the Black Death could bring to just one community, Raksha is visiting the abandoned village of Warren Percy in North Yorkshire to meet Mark Douglas from English Heritage.
So, Mark, we're here in the medieval village of Warren Percy. I mean, as an archaeologist, I can see all these lumps and bumps, but where are we?
Well, we're stood in the middle of the village at the moment. We're in fact in one of the manor houses.
The best way to discover what the village would have looked like is to view it from the air.
I mean, it's really incredible, isn't it? You can see the foundations of each single house.
You can almost see the entrances, look, on either side.
Oh, gosh, yeah, so you can see the little doorways.
Little doorways in them.
So how many households were living here predominantly?
It's reckoned to be around 40 at its height. It could be 10 to 15 people in a household. What we're looking at is a really vibrant, lively community. This is the parish church for Warren, a place where you go to hear mass, but it would also be a place where you go to meet people. It was effectively a village hall.
So that would have been a focal point for the community.
Everything you can think of that would happen in a village took place within the confines of the church.
So they're all going to the church, praying to God. They're all sitting next to each other, but actually that's the last thing that they should really be doing.
With so many people at close quarters, if any were infected with disease, transmission would have been inevitable.
What happens when the Black Death comes? How does it affect this bustling village?
Well, I mean, the estimates are between a third and half the population were wiped out by the Black Death. And it would have been a traumatic event. It would, without any shadow of a doubt, and not just for one village, but for the whole region.
In fact, staggeringly, there are over 3,000 abandoned medieval villages, just like Warren Percy, spread throughout Britain. You really begin to understand just how crippling the situation was. The disease had become unstoppable, laying waste to all in its path.
The Black Death killed indiscriminately. It was a great leveller because no one was safe. At least that's what people traditionally thought. But now, 700 years after the Black Death, genetic scientists have made a remarkable discovery.
To find out more about the latest scientific research on the Black Death, I'm meeting geneticist and expert on ancient DNA, Leicester University's Professor Turi King.
So scientists are still studying the Black Death today?
They are. There's been this really cool study recently. So what they did was they looked at skeletons of people who died before the Black Death, during, afterwards, and they zoomed in on bits of our DNA, so genes that are involved in the immune system.
So were they able to tell, for example, who was more likely to survive?
Yeah. So they found this really interesting thing. So people who succumbed to the Black Death seemed to carry a particular variant of a gene. And what it showed was that if they had this particular version, they were less able to fight off the disease.
Wow.
Essentially, what you've got is natural selection is happening. And we can see that happening by doing this study. So this is DNA sequence from an ancient specimen.
DNA is the genetic code inside our bodies, which makes us all unique.
So our DNA, it's our kind of instruction manual. It's things where we've got variants which kind of give us, blue eyes and dark hair and this kind of thing. But you also have variants in genes that affect your immune system. So our DNA is made up of 4 different building blocks, so G, C, T, and A. And you can see here, look, you've got one genetic difference. And if you found a T at this particular location, that had a really big effect. It meant that they produced a much shorter protein. And so their immune system wasn't working so well.
So some people would have been more likely to die because of their genetic code.
And it's just one tiny difference, one letter difference, but with such a big impact. And what they found was that after the plague, you get higher numbers of people who have got this version.
So the Black Death changed our landscape, our politics, our economy, and actually it changed us as well.
Yeah, it seems to have changed the gene pool. So the bacteria, Yersinia pestis, that's the bacteria that caused the Black Death, it's still with us.
It's still out there.
It is still around. Do you want to have a look at it?
Well, kind of.
Okay, so this is an animation of Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that caused the Black Death.
And the blue bits are the bacteria.
They are the bacteria. The whole thing, it's still very dangerous. There was an outbreak in Madagascar relatively recently, and somebody actually died from it in California in 2020.
Wow, so they're still dying? And with all the symptoms that we've recognised from 700 years ago?
Yeah, but I mean, we're in a good place now because we've got ways of containing it, we've got antibiotics and precautions that we can make. And the more we know about it, the more we can do things like develop vaccines against it.
By the end of 1349, this tiny bacteria had caused murderous havoc across Britain, Europe, and the wider world. No corner had escaped its wrath. But then, like the miracle people had been praying for, it slowed down. Experts today are still debating what happened. Perhaps the plague killed off so many of the rats that they stopped transmitting the disease from one place to the next. Perhaps the effort to clean things up improved the cleanliness and hygiene of communities. But more likely is so many of the population died that there just simply were fewer people to pass the disease on to. Either way, it's easy to imagine that the people who survived this terrible ordeal breathed a sigh of relief. Throughout 1348 and 1349, over roughly 500 days, the disease had caused utter devastation. Over half the population had been infected, and up to 3 million had died. Today, that would be the equivalent to nearly 30 million people. Across the globe, up to 200 million people are thought to have perished. The Black Death is one of those few global events that really did change the world. Not only did it kill swathes of people, both here and abroad, but it changed our landscapes as places emptied and became desolate. It made people question the class system and religious authority. It changed us genetically to this day. And the really terrifying thing is that the bacteria is still out there. It still has the power to kill.